Welcome to your lesson about macromolecules. You're going to find this hopefully entertaining. We're going to start this discussion looking at the element carbon. Carbon is, of course, what all living things are composed of, and it's the properties of carbon that make life possible. Because of carbon making these 4 covalent bonds, it's not every element that is able to do that or that has that capacity. But because carbon can make 4 covalent bonds, it can form large complex molecules. It can form long chains. It can form ring structures. It can form branched structures. And these large complex molecules are what make up life. The properties of carbon compounds, we call them organic compounds, are based on these things called functional groups, which I'm going to ask you to learn, these functional groups. But before we get to that, you can see, of course, there are various ways to represent carbon compounds. You can represent them using just the chemical formula. There's also the structural formula, which we're going to be drawing some of them in class. And then there are a couple of other representations. But either way, when you look at a molecule of methane, CH4, it looks something like this, a carbon with 4 single bonds to hydrogen, and you can represent it those different ways. Now back to functional groups. These are the main functional groups that I'm going to want you to learn, and they have different properties chemically, and so when attached to carbon, they provide a complex organic molecule or a macromolecule with that particular property. The first let's look at is a phosphate group. I sometimes call this one a POO group. Because it is a phosphate connected to, sometimes represented 3 oxygens, sometimes 4 oxygens, and then you'll see the attached hydrogen on some of them. That's a phosphate group, very important functional group. Then we have the carboxylic acid group, which is a carbon with a double bond to an oxygen and an OH group. That OH group, by the way, is called an alcohol group, also called a hydroxyl group, and it is found in many alcohols. Then we have the ketone group, which is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, so you can see that the carboxylic acid actually has a ketone in it right here. Then we have the aldehyde, which is a ketone with a hydrogen on the end. And so you can see that the carboxylic acid actually has the ketone and the alcohol. And then you have the amine group, which is a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens attached. And finally, we have the sulfhydryl, which is a sulfur with a hydrogen attached. I do want you to learn all of these functional groups, and we'll be building them in class. Now, the large carbon compounds that we're going to be learning about are made of smaller parts. The smaller parts we call monomers. The word monomer simply means small parts that make up something larger. When they're chained together, we call them polymers. So we're going to learn about several biological molecules or macromolecules that are polymers composed of monomers, kind of like links on a chain. A couple of terms I do want you to be aware of. Processes that build these macromolecules or processes that break down these macromolecules have certain names. For instance, when you build a macromolecule, we call that an anabolic process that's building up, and the reaction that occurs when this happens is a condensation reaction, which produces water. That's why it's called condensation. You make water in the process. The opposite reaction, breaking down, like digestion, is an example of breaking down. We call that a catabolic process, so digestion is catabolic. Protein building is anabolic. Anyhow, breaking down we call hydrolysis, because hydro means water and lysis means to break apart, so this is breaking apart with water. So actually water goes into this reaction and breaks apart the molecule. In the condensation reaction, water comes off and the molecule is built up. So those are 2 opposing reactions that happen in living things, building these large macromolecules and breaking them down. The 4 main types of macromolecules we're going to talk about are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Today's lesson is going to focus on carbohydrates and lipids, and proteins another day, and then nucleic acids. We're talking about DNA and RNA, and we're going to talk about those later in the semester. So let's start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are your familiar breads, rice, pasta, grains of all kinds. Potatoes will have some carbohydrates in them as well. All carbohydrates have this formula. They're a carbon, 2 hydrogens, and an oxygen. It's sometimes abbreviated CH2O like that, but carbohydrate literally means carbon, hydrogen, 8, meaning oxygen. The simplest carbohydrates are the monosaccharides, mono meaning one, saccharide meaning sugar. These are the simple sugars. These are monomers that make up larger polymers. Examples are glucose and fructose. They all have a ring structure, although they can exist also as a short chain. But notice that in this case, glucose and fructose are both C6H12O6, so it has that same pattern, CH2O. The job of the monosaccharides are quick energy. So when cells need energy, they're looking for a monosaccharide, and most of the food that you eat eventually gets broken down to become one of these monosaccharides, usually glucose. The second form of carbohydrate we're going to talk about are disaccharides, di meaning two. These are double sugars. These are two monosaccharides that have been joined by something called a glycosidic bond. And remember, this is a condensation reaction, so water comes out as the bond is formed. Two examples are sucrose and lactose. Lactose is milk sugar, you've probably heard of it. And sucrose is table sugar, that white stuff that you put, I don't know, I put it in my coffee. I don't know what you put it in, but you bake with it and everything. The white crystals that we're familiar with are sucrose. There are also oligosaccharides. Oligo means a few or a small number of sugars. These are short-chain carbohydrates with either with just a few monosaccharides that are bonded together, 3 to 9, anywhere between 3 and 9. These combined with proteins and some short fatty molecules function as signal molecules in cell membranes. So later in the semester we'll be talking about these signal molecules that are embedded in the cell membrane, and they serve to signal. Cells communicate with one another through these oligosaccharides. Finally, the most diverse group, the polysaccharides, poly meaning many. These are long chains of monosaccharides that have been bonded together through those glycosidic bonds. They either serve as storage molecules for energy or structural molecules. I want to give you 4 examples here. The first being starch. You've probably heard of starch. Starch is made by plants, and when they do photosynthesis, they store that energy in this form, starch, and then when they need energy, they can go get it. Of course, we eat the plant, and we get the starch that way. The other thing that plants make when they do photosynthesis, they make this carbohydrate, this polysaccharide called cellulose. We call it dietary fiber. Cellulose is another carbohydrate, but it's got a structure in such a way that it forms something that is indigestible. So when we eat plants, they do have cellulose in them, but we can't digest the cellulose, so it just goes right through us, and we call it fiber. It's supposed to be good for our digestive system and everything, but plants use it to build up their cell walls. It forms structure in plants. In animals, there's a molecule, a polysaccharide called glycogen, and I have a diagram here of it. Glycogen is a storage carbohydrate that we use. It's storing energy in the liver, and this would be utilized anytime when you need some energy, you haven't eaten in a while, you feel very hungry, and your blood sugar drops. So your hormones are released, and they go and they get the glycogen that has been stored in the liver after you've eaten, and they break down the glycogen quickly to provide quick glucose and energy for your body. So you may have noticed, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but you may have noticed that if you get really hungry and then you haven't had a chance to eat, after a while you don't feel so hungry anymore. And then sometimes it's lunchtime and you don't feel like eating. Well, what's happened is you've mobilized the glycogen from your liver, and it brings your blood sugar back up and you don't feel hungry anymore. So that's an animal's storage form of a polysaccharide, glycogen. The other example I have is chitin. Chitin is a polysaccharide made by insects and actually other arthropods, and it's used to build their exoskeleton. So the exoskeleton of an insect is actually made of a carbohydrate. All right, moving on, let's talk about lipids. Lipids are fats, oils, waxes, and sterols, or steroid molecules. These are all hydrophobic molecules. They are insoluble in water. In other words, they don't dissolve in water, and they actually repel water. Lipids are also important structures, and they form energy for long-term storage. So whatever in excess that you eat that you don't use and it doesn't become glycogen and get stored in the liver, it's going to end up in your adipose tissue, which is tissue that stores lipid for later. If there's no food available, then you have it. Now, the most common form of lipid is triglycerides in animals. Triglycerides are composed of 3 fatty acids and a molecule known as glycerol. So you'll see this triglyceride here. We have 1, 2, 3 fatty acid chains, which as you can see are long carbon chains with attached hydrogen atoms. And attached to that is this piece called glycerol. Now again, these are commonly found in your blood, they're found in foods, but a triglyceride by itself cannot enter a cell, so it is actually broken down into the 3 component fatty acids and the glycerol, and then it enters cells. Let's talk a little more about fatty acids. There are 2 kinds of fatty acids. The first we're going to call saturated, that's its name. In a saturated fatty acid, all of the carbons are single bonds. All of the carbons are attached to each other by single bonds. So they are saturated with hydrogen. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see every single carbon atom has an attached hydrogen atom. So that every single carbon is attached by a single bond going all the way down, and at every carbon there is a hydrogen, bonded to every other place. So what that means is that it's full of hydrogen. That's why it's called saturated. Now, the characteristic of fatty acids is that they are solid at room temperature, and they're usually found from animal products. There are some exceptions. One very obvious example is butter. So butter is solid at room temperature, and it is fully saturated. The other type of fatty acid we call unsaturated. It has at least, as you can see here, 1 double bond between carbons. What that does is it makes that part of the molecule sort of flexible. It moves around, and we'll build these in class so you can see how that works. But having just that 1 double bond means that fatty acid is flexible. What that means in practical terms is that these fatty acids are liquids at room temperature. They are fluid. They can move around. So these are our oils. That's what we're talking about. They're commonly found in plants. There's another term you may have heard of, polyunsaturated. Polyunsaturated fatty acids have many double bonds, not just 1. And they're supposed to be the healthiest to eat. They're found in actually fish and then in some foods like olive oils. Another type of lipid you need to know about is a phospholipid. A phospholipid is what makes up the cell membrane. You may have learned about this before in honors biology. A phospholipid is 2 fatty acids, which we just talked about, that are bound to a phosphate group. Remember, that was our friend, the poo group. Phosphates are hydrophilic. Of course, the fatty acids are hydrophobic. And so in one molecule, you have a molecule that will partially dissolve in water, which is exactly what you want to make up a cell membrane. The poo end, the polar end, the hydrophilic end can dissolve in water, and then the fatty acid end does not, and that forms a barrier for movement of molecules across that membrane. So the cell membrane looks something like this. You've got a double layer of these phospholipids. Another group of lipids are the sterols or steroids. These are all ring structures that are lipids. They're derived from cholesterol, and most of these we make or animals make in their bodies, but they have to start with the backbone of cholesterol, and that's why you actually need cholesterol in your diet. You don't want too much of it, but you actually do need to consume it so that you can produce these molecules that you need. Steroid hormones are an example of sterols, including the male hormone testosterone, the female estradiols or estrogen, and cortisol, which is a very important hormone that helps in your body. One thing I wanted you to notice is that if you look at these structures, they're almost all exactly the same. There's very small changes, mostly occurring up here. So if you see cholesterol that you eat, then your body converts that to vitamin D, because you need that in your body, and you see all it's doing is sort of rearranging the molecules. And then you have something like cortisone or cortisol, and again, the ring is almost the same, and all you're changing is something up in here. Some functional groups get changed, and it changes the whole molecule in terms of what function it can do in the body. All right, almost done. Last lipid I wanted to talk about are waxes. And you're familiar with candle wax, I'm sure. Waxes, this is what a wax looks like, and every little bump there is actually a carbon with hydrogens attached. Okay, so this is really long, and on one end you've got this ketone. Waxes are important in living things, especially for plants. They help plants to retain water and not lose moisture and dehydrate. And also, the waxy layer around a plant helps it to avoid parasites getting in and pathogenic substances coming in. So that's it for carbohydrates and lipids. You know your functional groups. And next time we're going to talk about proteins and enzymes.